So hello everybody, and a very warm welcome to our large online audience and our slightly less large but very present in the room audience, to a very special event focused on this just published book on white saviorism in international development. It's incredibly timely. It comes at a moment when I think all of us who are involved and whose work connects us to development or development studies, whether as researchers or learners or practitioners or professionals, are reflecting harder and more critically than ever on questions of equity and justice, especially around race, on development's histories and its colonial legacies and what that means about its futures and how it might need to be recast, and on how problematic power relations manifest and might be challenged, and on our personal and social and political positions in all of this. So it's really great to have another and really hard-hitting contribution to this zeitgeist, to challenge us and to make us think, which is exactly what this book does. And I've had the privilege to have a flick through it, and I would strongly encourage everybody to read it with great interest. As I'm sure the contributors will tell you on, it's a mixture of theoretical chapters, testimonies and lived experiences from contributors across the global south, and they address both the implicit and often more explicit forms of what they elaborate in really interesting ways as this concept of white saviorism in international development. So we're privileged today to have three of the co-editors with us in one way or another. So in the room with me here, I'm very pleased to welcome Themrise Khan, one of the co-editors whose work is focused on both policy and qualitative research and evaluation. She's based in Pakistan. Her career has spanned a whole range of issues, from gender and development to many others. Then online, we have from Kampala, Dixon Kanyaluka, who is a lecturer in the Department of Philosophy at Makerere University. And he's also worked on a whole range of questions with interest in bioethics and governance and philosophy, as well as social justice and futures research. He's been involved in a lot of collaborative national and international programs and networks, particularly in the African context. And then we have Maika Sondaji, who is a professor of international development and global studies at the University of Ottawa in Canada. She's joining us today from Germany, where she tells me she's only temporarily there at a workshop, but she's normally in Ottawa. And her work spans international and multilateral organizations as well as feminist and global South approaches in international relations, and a lot of work on post-colonial theory. So a great group heading up a fantastic group of contributors. Each of them is going to share their thoughts and reflections and contributions to the book for about 10 minutes. Then we'll open up for Q&A. I've got one or two things I'd really like to ask, so I might jump in first. And then we'll open up to questions from the room and from the online audience. Those online, please put your questions that you'd like to ask in the Q&A function at the bottom of your screen. And Gary will be monitoring those and we'll read them out when we come to the Q&A. And also please note that the closed captions facility is available on Zoom for anybody who'd find that helpful. So without further ado, I think Themrise is going to start us off. So over to you.
Great. Thank you very much for joining us today. It's a pleasure to be here, me personally in the UK, and on behalf of Micah and Ann Dixon, my co-editors, welcome. So I will just start off a little bit about the genesis of the book, and then my colleagues will take on a little more detail about its contents. The book, I have to admit, was Micah's idea, Micah Sundarji, and the reason behind it was the idea of white saviorism. So Dixon and I in particular I'm a practitioner, I'm a hardcore practitioner based in Pakistan, so development has been part of my life and my career for over 25 years. That's all I've ever done. And Micah and Dixon are more from the academic side. Dixon has a practitioner-based experience as well. And for us, the question of white saviorism was something that I know I personally had never really thought about it or reflected on it in all my career. But given the last 2 or 3 years, the anti-racist and justice activity that's been happening because of George Floyd, the incident around George Floyd, the issue of, the role of the global North in the rest of our lives is very prominent. And the international development sector is obviously, the international part of it is the global North. But the idea that nobody ever questioned them about their role and their attitudes and the ethos and the approaches that they were bringing into other countries was something that we thought needs to be questioned. And so the idea of white saviorism, which for us has been around for many years, but never really brought out in terms of the international development field, was something we thought would be interesting to explore in more detail. And so the three of us got together and online, this was all done during COVID, and we came up with a proposal about what exactly we wanted to address. A lot of it was the whole colonial and racist approach towards development taken by the global North and the global South. And the idea was also to raise the voices of those who had been part of this, but on the other side, so to speak. So all the practitioners, the activists, and the academics who were on the receiving end of international development programming and aid from the global North. And so we put out an open call for papers. We were very, very specific about the fact that we wanted only writers and contributors from the global South, because we thought a lot has already been spoken about by the global North about their own role in their own words. So we wanted to turn the tables around and say, okay, now let everybody listen to the other side. And that's what we did. And we got a fantastic collection of people from all over the global South, so Latin America, Africa, South Asia. We tried to reflect a cross-section of genders and countries as much as we could. It's not easy because there are a lot of countries out there, but the contributions that we got were very, very rich in identifying a cross-section of geography across the world. We decided that we didn't want this to be just an academic book, because there are a lot of those around as well. And international development is more of a practitioner-based area, less academic. So we wanted a mix. So we had a few academics, we had a few practitioners who spoke about their careers in international development, but we also had what we call lived experiences now in sociology and anthropology. So actual people telling their stories about personal events and experiences that they had while working with the so-called white saviors in different parts of the world. So it's a really eclectic mix of chapters. So we've got a few academics, hardcore academic chapters that look at post-colonial theory. We've got some practitioner-based chapters about people talking about issues like evaluation in international development or how programming is developed. And then we've got personal stories. And we gave our authors free rein to write in any way they wanted. So we literally have some fictional stories in there by some of our contributors who did not want to be named. They were too, they were concerned because there is this backlash that a lot of us have from the Global South about speaking out about our so-called employers and the privileged global North. But at the end of it, we got a very, very interesting mix of issues that range from, the war in Afghanistan to how white feminists come into countries like mine and, do development, to indigenous cultures around the world and the role of, colonial societies and annihilating them. So it's a very, very eclectic mix of chapters, which we hope you will be able to access and read. And we have a bunch of conclusions and issues that have emerged from all the issues that the chapters have raised, which we will talk about later as well. But I'd like to pass on the mic to my colleague, Maika Sonderji, who will tell you a little bit about how we approach the issue of white saviorism, how we defined it as co-editors, and what our thinking behind the book was. Maika, over to you.
Thank you. Thank you very much, Themrise. Everything you say is so insightful, and I think that's a very crucial table to set before we talk about the actual theory, because our process was, we hope, a process that was a bit more, horizontal, and with Daraja Press who let us do that, and we paid people for their work, stuff like that. I think it's important in academia, in development, to do the parallel with including or consulting or partnering with partners without paying them for their work is a problem still in the field. Two things you said that I want to go back on that are really interesting. I think it's true that we live in an era where we talk a lot about the failures of development. One example would be Easterly with, the first book he wrote on the white man's burden. But then based on a poem by Kipling, The White Man's Burden, but then the white aspect of it is lost in translation. And Paley, in a keynote speech a few years ago, a Black scholar talked about that, the white gaze of development, the idea that, yes, we say, oh, we failed here, but we never mention how white, I want to say, supremacy or racial hierarchies, or the white gaze that we have, the Western gaze, I would say, can influence if we fail or not in the projects we do. And so another thing that you've mentioned, Themrise, is that the knowledge was already there. So I think what we tried to do is to formalize what has been done, what has been written for decades by African and Global South observers. Every time there's an initiative like Coney 2012 or the Louise Linton book, In Congo's Shadow, or a campaign that puts white doctors helping Black kids and stuff like that, people like No White Saviors or Charity So White or Africa is a Country. A lot of activists and observers have written, and the article that's really cited on what the white savior complex is the White Savior Industrial Complex by Tehu Cole, which was written in The Atlantic. So we felt like there was a space here for Global South thinkers and doers who have lived through white saviorism, who wanted to share their experience and their knowledge about it. So that's what we tried to do. And with all these contributions, we came in the introduction with what it is, what we call white saviorism, and we prefer the term white saviorism to white savior complex because the white savior complex sometimes refers unconsciously to an individual psychological trait, which is only part of our definition. So our definition is in two parts, I would say. So first, yes, it is about white saviors or Western saviors, as a lot of people in the book talk about. It's also about brown saviors. There's a few chapters about that. There's women's saviors. It's not just, and we'll come back to that, but it's not, this book is not against white people. It's against white supremacy as a structure. And No White Saviors, the organization I talked to you about from Uganda, says it really well. They say we never said no white people. We just think that white people should not be the center of the story. So anyway, so the definition, first part, individual attitudes, and you've all encountered them. This helping imperative, this idea that we can send young white Canadians, for example, in India, to paint a school that was painted 3 months ago, to make them feel like they can do something, which promotes a narratives where white people are there to help. They have agency. They know more than global South actors what to do. The Louise Linton book is also an example of that. When we have campaigns which puts the white people as agents and then the racialized people as receivers of development. So that's one thing, and that's an attitude or a mindset that we should confront. But then on the other side, much more important, is this global structure of power based on white supremacy. So white saviorism is not just about individuals being, white saviors or promoting this attitude of superiority. It's also about this global structure of power in the system we live in, a capitalist, patriarchal, colonial system that still encourages exploitation by companies, by government, when we sign the trade agreements, when we let, I know Canada much more, but when we let Canadian mining companies go in countries and pay nearly no tax and then come back and, or companies will steal indigenous wealth or indigenous knowledge and then put a patent on a medicine, for example. So that kind of system that is still in place, but the irony of that system, which we accept, and then on the other side, we go and help and do some projects. So for example, in Canada, the fact that we encourage women from Guatemala, for example, to come and work here as maid, not well paid often, with no possibility of having the citizenship. And because we want to, get advantage of this system and we need them. But then on the other side, we're going to do empowerment projects in Guatemala and feel better about the whole system we participate in. So it's often something that is not reflected on. It's not like, oh, we're bad people. It's really not what we're saying. We're saying we're encouraging a system while on the other side perceiving ourselves as benevolent, nice people. And so this is all based on the colonial ladder. We go back to colonialism a lot because an indigenous author in our book talks about how this idea that white people can help and save non-white people was present even in colonialism, and in how Bartolomé de las Casas came to what we now call Latin America and was literally saying, we have writings of him saying that he wanted to save indigenous people, save their souls. So it was not, people were not thinking, oh, we're going to exploit them. No, there were also, a lot of people were also, maybe some people were, but a lot of people were also trying to help and save them. And so this idea that we want to civilize populations that are considered uncivilized during colonization has developed and transformed into, now we want to develop countries that we consider as, we don't say that anymore, but underdeveloped or in development, which is that's an example of something we need to change, is this narrative of emergent countries or in development. When we talk about China as an emergent country, it's ironic because China has been a hegemon of the world way longer than the US. Why did and I put quotation marks, the great discoveries happened? Because we wanted to go to India and China to get not only silk and spices, but also all the technologies that they had, all the infrastructure that they had. If we talk about African princes who were much richer than a European prince before colonization, or if we think about, city organizations in what we call now Latin America, or the Maya civilization or Inca civilization. So it seems ironic now to say, oh, you should develop in such a way like we did, Western countries, which if we suggest that, it means that we're telling them to go and exploit other countries, because colonialism and slavery is what made Western countries richer and enabled capitalism to flourish in those countries. And so it seems ironic to have prescriptions. And I think we realize that, my research on the World Bank shows that most macroeconomists I talk to at the World Bank are saying that prescriptions of liberalization, privatization without thinking about local circumstances have failed. But we don't think, oh, but why did we suggest that? And why has it failed? Namely, because that's not really how we developed. We developed with protectionism and exploiting and going to get other people's wealth and workforce through slavery. Anyway, so to conclude, I want to prevent one question that for sure will come, and Dixon and Themrise and I often talk about that, how, someone is going to ask for solutions. And we came up with an answer to that the last time we were together for a podcast. The idea is that if we had a solution, ready-made, one sentence or even 1 hour talk about a solution, we would do the same thing we're criticizing, that is having a one-size-fits-all solution. So I think I just want to leave you with this idea developed by Ngugi wa Thiong'o about the decolonization of the mind. So deconstructing these hierarchies of power in our work, in our narratives, in the global structure, means deconstructing these hierarchies in our minds. And I think Olivia Alasso from White Saviorism says it really well in the foreword of our book. And she says, how can individuals in positions of privilege, especially those racialized as white, how can they do better? And she answers one word: listen. So I think that's what we try to do with the book. And that's what we're suggesting is listening. And that means active listening. That means creating spaces where Global South practitioners and partners feel comfortable calling us in or calling us out, depending on the situation. So anyway, happy to be here, and I'm looking forward to the questions.
Dixon, did you want to?
Okay, thank you, IDS, for allowing us to have this platform. And as Micah was ending, that's what we really want, space so that other voices can be heard. So I want to start from the statement that she already hinted. I said, we're not trying to paint white people bad people. So we shouldn't take that kind of attitude. But our goal is to open the space and listen to each other. Now, since she has already gone into some of the detail of the work, let me go back to the structure of the book. If you look at the book, we pick these sentiments that were existing in the activist world, in social media, and Themrise mentioned them, Mike has referred to them. A lot of writers were raising these sentiments and raising these issues. And we realize as people engaged in maybe development work and training tomorrow's development workers and in the universities and other institutions, these books were not there. There were no books discussing this matter. So we thought we could bring this book so that as we train tomorrow's development workers, they can think about these issues and perhaps avoid the mistakes that have been made over the years. So for those of you who have the book, look at the structure of the book, it combines the theoretical part and the practical part, lived experiences. So in the theoretical part, we allowed people to explore the conceptual issues, and maybe to note for those who have not got the book, we really tone down the language that is accessible, it is easy to read, so that everyone can really understand what is being discussed. And being from the background of philosophy, and my friends, please tone down the philosophy. So we made it really simple and easy to access, so that everyone can read the book and understand this. So I want to say that we try to create a canvas. This book is like a canvas. When you're reading it, look at it as a painting, which is not finished, of course, but we try to paint a picture to understand, so that the reader can understand what is White Saviorism. Now, yesterday, after Michael left, I had some discussion with some people, and I'm more and more thinking that we should instead call it Saviorism, because we have varieties of them in the book: white, brown, feminist, and many other saviorist mentality. And this is what we are trying to look at. We are trying to explain how did this saviorism come about? And why is it that it's one of the reasons why many development projects fail? Many development plans and whatever we have over the last 50-something years, miserably, many things fail because of this saviorist mentality, and which we need to interrogate. So in some chapters, we get into the concepts and the meanings and all those things that my colleagues have mentioned. In some chapters, we explain the psychosocial analysis of what is a mindset of someone who turns into a kind of saviorist person. And then we also handle some parts, the moral issues, the moral challenges that emerge because of this mindset. So the book is trying to show that the white saviorist mindset or structures or whatever they may be, they are a construct, and we can examine them and look at where things have not worked well, and we deconstruct them or rethink them so we can do things better in the development industry. So the aim of the book is to really cause a discussion. And as my colleagues have said, the discussion has started, and we think some people, for perhaps those online, those in the room, and many others will pick the discussion from here and begin to ask the tough questions, which we raise in the book. So my encouragement is that we shouldn't be fearful to examine these questions. As Themrise mentioned at the beginning, that sometimes you get backlash. There are people who contributed the book who are afraid, who, if their name appears in a chapter, others pulled out along the way. Okay, the story is really long. I'm not going to get the story of the book, but finally the book is here, and we really want to hear, to see that the discourse is taking place. There's an interrogation so that people the voices from the South can be part of the development process, so that no one. Let me end with this quote, not a quote, but a statement that maybe probably captures what the book is about. The development burden of the world is so big to be carried by only the global North, or the so-called white people. So it is so huge, there is no one who can really be the savior of the world, who can really go out there and have a magic wand and remove everything. Rather, we should allow all hands on the deck, all people. There are people who are, for example, in the global South, in a certain village or somewhere, who have a certain approach or method that they use, which can solve a certain problem. But when they're not given space to say it or to bring it out, they take a back seat, or no one gives them a room. Someone comes in and they think they know everything, and the people who have been in these spaces for quite centuries, who have developed certain technologies, certain approaches over years and years, who just need to be helped so that they can make it out there so that it's accessible to everyone, can really contribute to the development trajectory. So that's all that we want this book to achieve, so that the voices that people who have not been really contributed to this development discourse can be heard. And I want to pause there for now. Thank you very much.
Yes.
Concluding comments.
Just to wind up and take the conversation from my colleagues as well. I think one question that's really important is, our location. So even today, where are we sitting? We're sitting in the Institute of Development Studies. And you are now UK's #1 university for development studies. But the question arises is, whose development are you studying or teaching, right? Is it yours? Is it the UK's? If not, whose? And why? That's the biggest question that we want to pose, particularly to academia in the Western world. And this is not just IDS, this is development studies across the Western world. If you come to a country like mine, Pakistan, or if you went to Uganda, we have very, very few departments of development studies. We just don't do it in our own countries because we don't see the need to do it. If we do, we talk about our own countries. So the question arises, then why do countries of the West do it? And this is something I think for you to reflect on in terms of what is it exactly you want to achieve. And some of our academics in the book talk about this as well. I mean, our voices as people of the global South, academics of the global South, should you not be using our knowledge instead of creating your own knowledge, which actually comes from us? So these, I think, are very important questions that we would like everybody to start thinking about, your own role and your location in this world of international development. And I think academia is most well placed to perhaps dig into this deeper, because I know the development sector itself, the INGOs, the NGOs, the international donors, they are very resistant to this idea. And that's where the whole idea of white saviorism comes from, because they truly believe that they are out to save everybody else. And I'll just give, FCDO as an example, the whole idea of UK aid cuts. Everybody's crying that people will die in Africa and around the world. They'll die of hunger, they'll die of conflict if we don't go and help them. And the idea is, well, I mean, they're dying anyway, so to speak, right? I mean, this is how we look at it. Do not use our hunger and our conflict and our suffering to bolster an agenda that is not necessarily ours. So I think that's something we'd like the book and everybody else to reflect on. And a couple of other things, like Dixon said, it is about saviorism, not necessarily white, because we had some of our findings were talking about how the idea of colonial power brought in by the white Western world has influenced people like us. So I am a savior of those less privileged in my own country. Where did I get that idea of privilege? There are brown saviors who go into Africa to save Black people. Where did that idea of privilege come from? So I think this influence that white saviorism has had on the rest of the world is also something we need to consider very carefully, that it is having a very destructive influence about our own ideas of power and our notions of power. We're using the power that is used on us, on others less fortunate than us. And that's not what we need to be doing. That chain of power and control is coming down the line, but we need to end it at some point, because otherwise we are all perpetuating, inequality of power structures in some way or another. And I think from our view, it is coming very much from the top, and very much from the top is where the money is, where the political control is, and that is primarily in the Western world. So I think we'll end there and open it up to questions. And if Melissa, you have
thank you
questions
so
as well.
much, the three of you. Well, I'm going to jump in. I'm sure there'll be a lot of questions, but I'm going to use this privilege to ask two things that I'd like to just explore a little bit further. And the first is about boundaries and location, and the second is about agency. So the first one, I think all of us can read this book and recognize so much in it about the structures of power. And about some of the boundaries that it puts in place, and the assumptions about how the directions in which knowledge and power and funding flow from the north to the south. But what slightly bothers me is that I think these categories of global north and global south are themselves part of the problem. It's a set of categories that at IDS over the last, a couple of decades, we've been working very hard to unpick and actually to move away from in all kinds of ways. I think you don't find those labels used so often now. There's a lot of our research and our teaching and our learning which is about development in our own backyard, as it were, which calls out questions around inequality and hunger. In Brighton, around the corner, there are students in this room who will be doing their projects on these questions as they pertain in the UK as well as elsewhere. And the ways that we're defining development at IDS, and not to say it's always practiced that way and professionalized that way, is to say development is positive change for everyone, everywhere, whether they live in Bamako or Pakistan or Brighton. So I'm quite interested really in two questions, whether you as contributors see that move to universal development as progressive change for everyone as part of the solution. And secondly, question back to you, in using so overtly those categories of global north and global south, as you do, for political reasons, are you actually helping to reinforce the very categories that you also want to undermine? So that's my first question. The second is about agency. And I think as you're very clear in saying that you're not talking about individuals here, you're talking about structures of power, complexes, isms, discourses, one might like to say, and the axes along which they work, whether they're racialized, whether they're along the idea of saviorism. But saviors, or there's always another side to that. There's always, if you've got saviors, you've somehow got victims who are there to be saved. And part of what academics who kind of study discourse and power do is also to look at how those victims then internalize those structures, so they themselves come to see themselves as victims. And I'm just wondering, because I haven't read the whole book, to what extent you're also documenting the extent to which people, so-called development beneficiaries, actually see themselves that way. Because I think if we look at development, we see some of what you document, but we also see so many agentive ways in which so-called beneficiaries and victims actually rework, appropriate development practice and resources, make them their own, use them as part of their own projects and struggles, and attempts to create futures in ways that are meaningful for them. And is there a risk that in overplaying a saviorism complex, we actually overlook some of that? I'm reminded here of I mean, the book interplays with ideas about decolonization without taking them fully on board, and you're clear about that. But it reminds me a little bit of what Tayo Olufemi says in another very recent, really good book against decolonization, where he sees decolonization as a white discourse that, applied in overgeneralizing ways, assumes, in his case, African people to be victims of and entrapped in colonial legacies in ways that actually really deny the vibrancy and of their own agency, appropriation of culture, modernities, their own agency and action. So is there a risk that overplaying the white savior complex undoes and unrecognizes the very agency that we want to recognize? So maybe those, I mean, I'm sort of putting these out there, they were just two reactions on reading your very, very interesting book. And maybe we want to take some other questions and then perhaps those are things to think about and come back to. So let's open, I mean, unless you want to say anything about those.
No, if you want us to respond to this first, we can do that at the military questions. Yeah. Micah, Dixon, do you want to take on any of the questions first?
You can start, and I can go with the language question.
Okay. All right. Great. I'll start with your last question then. The idea of the risk of overplaying saviorism. I don't think so. From a purely practitioner's perspective, which I am, I think the idea of looking, international development aid is it's a narrow focus. It's not global, right? So whatever we talk about in terms of projects and programming, which is how aid works, the impacts of that are not national at scale. We still don't have the evidence of such programming and such assistance making national impact, changing the face of a country, changing the direction of a country's progress economically or socially. I don't think we can claim that, even though a lot of donors like to claim that in various pockets. So I think the idea of good work being done, for instance, in one part of a country might be overshadowed by saying it's white saviorism. I don't think so, because I don't know what the scale of that impact will be on that country itself. You may be able to help pockets here and there, which is again what I think development aid programming does. It helps, it works in pockets. Because your national impact is governed by the government itself. and working government to government is a very difficult thing. Aid cannot change a government's direction. It should not change a government's direction. So I don't think I think white saviorism plays into it more because work is done on smaller scales. It's done in little pockets. It's done on a projectized and programmatic way. Even development research is done that way. We do it in pockets in different small little parts of a country, a district, a province. We do very little work on a very sustained long-term basis that perhaps could lead to some change. So I would personally disagree with that based on my own experience. And that's why we feel white saviorism is so potent, because it does work in those little pockets. And people like to use that. Donors love to say, oh, we made an impact in such and such village of 20 people. But okay, what happened beyond that? Do you know that you did the same project in the village next door and it failed miserably? What happened to that? So I don't think we're overplaying it when it comes to international aid. We may be, if we're talking about saviorism, on a political scale, that, country A wants to go and save country B, which we've seen, that's been done militarily by the US, and we've seen the result of that as well. So I would disagree with that. I don't think that we're overplaying it. And I don't think that agency is either there, because if you go and speak to beneficiaries and recipients, they will never actually tell you behind the scenes that this project has helped us. This is the information we as project workers want out of them. In reality, it really hasn't helped that household at all. And I think that is the information that is suppressed and we don't know about. But we living the long term in those countries can see that it hasn't. I mean, I've personally been pushed development programming onto communities in Pakistan. And now I feel terribly guilty about doing that, because what did I do and why did I do it? Because those households, those families, those villages did not benefit an iota from it. So I think, the question of agency is also a very gray area one. So I'll just end there, and I'll leave the other two questions for Mike and Dixon, if they'd like to answer them.
Yeah, I can start, and then Dixon can address also the question of agency, because we got that in Uganda as well. And I think Themrise said it well. First, we're not saying that all projects of development failed miserably in all contexts, in all communities, in all parts of the world. What we're saying is that there's this structure that is often not talked about. And so in my circles, I work in a School of International Development and Global Studies. I must tell you that most of the time, not most of the time, but I mean, much more often, we talk about corrupt leaders in Africa. We talk about how the incapacity, we talk about we need to do capacity building, capacities are not there. We talk about that much more than we talk about how, I don't know, African philosophies could help us be less individualist. Maybe some indigenous methodologies could help us understand the world better. It's just to counter the narrative is what I'm trying to say. It's not to say that, especially in my work, I'm not saying that we should stop flows of money and knowledge from the north to the south. In a way, we need to acknowledge the colonial legacy of inequalities. And if we do that, in my opinion, and Themrise and I, that's why we're a good team, because we disagree on some issues. I'm more optimistic, I think, about our capacity to do that. But I think if we recognize that we participated in underdeveloping the world through colonialism and slavery and now capitalism, well, we need to do something about it. And we need to implement solidarity practices, cooperation practices that are not exploitative and that are not based on this narrative that we know best. It would be based on a narrative of social justice, and we need to live in a world that's more just. And that leads to your first question about development, which is also a question by Meenakshi in the chat about this term development. And I must say that I have I'm always cringing a little bit when I use the word development, and that's in my signature in all my emails. And we might have put quotation mark. I think the idea of the book, as Dixon said, is to be a a piece of rock in the water and start a conversation in those circles. I think IDS saw that title and was like, oh, that would be interesting for us. Using the words can be a powerful catalyst for conversations. But it's true, development means that ladder of modernity, that ladder of what used to be civilization. And so, for example, Felwine Sarr, Senegalese author, poet, but also philosopher, an economist, talks about Afrotopia. So he talks about everyone's dignity. So we should not say like, oh, we don't want education and health or human development for everyone. We do, but we just don't want it to look like the model to follow is Western. I wrote an article once for media about how the United States are an underdeveloped country. If you look at that penalty, if you look at inequalities in health access, if you look at death of Black women when they give birth versus white women, if you look at the treatment of indigenous populations, like all these things, like, are they really developed? And how did they develop? So if we put that into question, I think the word development doesn't make much sense. That's why I would tend to, not disagree with you, but global south, global north, for me, as of now, are like the least harmful terminology, but I would be happy to follow other types of terminology. Some global south authors have suggested minority versus majority countries, but I still work with people. I wrote a chapter recently with economists at McGill who wanted to use the word, and we ended up doing that, using the word in development and developed countries, which I strongly suggest against, because I think global south and global north at least are less normative. And it's debatable. There's a lot of debate about that. Even Sylvia Tamale, who's an Ugandan author, says that we should use the word Africa to talk about this socio-historical conditions of the continent and to promote Pan-Africanism. So global south and global north are still there's some socio-historical similarities that the terms point at. Anyways, but Dixon, do you want to add anything about the agency question?
Okay, I want to start with the question she raised about Taiwo's book, that is against decolonization. He argues that decolonization has become an industry, and somehow modern African scholars are infantilizing the African and something like that. But if you read his work, because we had a seminar where we discussed part of what he was saying, he is actually reinforcing what he is against, just like the moderator today has just mentioned, that when we use these terms, global south, global north, aren't we instead entrenching? Okay, you notice that in order to achieve a perfect situation of decolonization, we have to totally abandon the language that was brought to Africa. And that will cease communicating to people, because if we go back to each one to their own traditional language, then we shall not be communicating across each other and go back to our enclosures, and then we cannot communicate anymore. So we as African scholars, as Micah mentioned, Ngugi wa Thiong'o, the Kenyan philosopher who wrote on the decolonization of the mind, for him, he focuses on the language. Language matters in order to colonize the mind. So you come with a project. Imagine you are like Themrise, you go to a village in Pakistan or in Africa, Uganda, you are talking about climate change. What does climate change mean to a traditional African person? You have to get a language that they use. So language already affects the agency of the person. They don't know what you're talking about. So you find old people, elderly women, just smiling at this young Western savior in quotes, coming to teach them about climate change, holding a seminar and filling out an evaluation form that there were 50 women there, and there were pictures taken, and they're smiling. But the agency of those people has been affected. They leave the room when they feel like they are infantilized. They're made like children who don't know what is actually going on. This one comes in with their terminologies. So we consider that issues in the writing of the book, and that's why we focus on simplifying the language and make it as accessible as possible. granted, we cannot completely say that we can't use those terms, because some people will understand us by using those terms, global south, global north. Already on the side, there have been a discussion online. I was reading some of the comments. Micah is starting, I mean, some part raising the issue, should we use the term development anymore? Because there are some people who can only be reached by using that word, then we have to use it. But the aim, as someone gets into the book and interrogates it, the aim is to raise question marks so that you make, the first level is the entry, so that the person understands what you're talking about. If we completely neglect, because I remember my colleagues can tell you, we had a long discussion back and forth. Should we use global north, global south, developed and underdeveloped? The debate was quite a long debate, and we can't really subject the audience here to that internal back and forth. But our idea was that we need to have a language that can be understood by those we want to reach with this work. So we cannot entirely divorce from some of the terminologies that have been dominant in the discourse for quite some time. And we need to reach out those people who have been entrenched, development workers, even the new ones who are coming in, so that they understand what is happening, and that's so that they can get invited into the world of the book and begin to understand it. Now, going back to the question of agency, that question, if you have, if a continent has been subjected to.
Dixon, sorry to interrupt you, but we've got a lot of questions in the chat.
Okay.
If we just move on to them?
Maybe in the room. So I feel I don't want to dominate it in asking things. So perhaps we can hold this. Let's now take a round. Perhaps we'll begin. Maybe Gary, you could just give us some of those that are coming through the chat. And also then we'll take some from the room, and just here, because this is clearly a conversation that we want to.
This is from Thomas. How does the saviour mentality manifest itself within the leadership structures of INGOs?
Okay, so that's a good one.
Another one, a very quick question. What does the cover image symbolize of the book?
Okay, that's nice.
And this is from another one. So, to change the discourse, is there an alternative word to replace development?
Okay.
There's lots of others. Right?
Okay.
Lots of others. Let's see if we've got anybody who wants to contribute from the room. Yeah, Annabelle.
Hi there. So my question was around kind of target audiences and how we make sure that the right people or target people are involved in the discourse, because I find a lot of the time when we talk about decolonization or white saviorism, it becomes a bit of an echo chamber, because the people who attend events like this or are interested in reading a book like yours are people who are already thinking about the issue. So any advice, maybe you've thought about it in the marketing for your book, or kind of going through the process of thinking about this, but how do we reach people who have a savior mentality and don't want to acknowledge it? And because I think that's where real change starts to happen. Thank you.
Great. Yeah, let's go to the back there.
I'll try to ask my question in the manner I can, but my question is around issues of representation being a sort of prescription for when we have discussions like this or within these sort of organizations. So something that you professed at the beginning of the event was thinking about white saviorism intersectionally, because yes, it is whiteness as a weapon, but white saviorism is also texturism, it's Afrophobia, it's heteropatriarchy, it's so many things, and all of these sort of axes of oppression maintain white supremacy as a structure, right? And a lot of these IGOs and within development, and when we work on these projects, follow this axis of white saviorism that upholds all of these inequalities and inequities. And practically speaking, I mean, in the backdrop of just the very big movements of anti-racism that you're seeing in social justice in general, the biggest, I mean, every company, every organization now has a DEI, so diversity, equality, inclusion. And the solution to that is like, oh, just plop a Black person there, just plop a woman there, you know what I mean? But do we not then risk, particularly these institutions that are built on saviorist practice, do we not then risk then A, putting these people from already marginalized communities in harm's way, be then putting these marginalized individuals in spaces that were not built for them to thrive in? And at what point are they then just reproducing narratives of coloniality? And then on a practical standpoint, I mean, here we're all pretty much in international development and development. When you first enter an organization in order to make some form of change, you're not going to be able to just go in there and just do an automatic transformative disruption. It takes steps, and particularly in something like development that is so hierarchical, before you can even reach the point where you can do transformative disruption, there are so many things you have to go through, this experience you need to go through. I mean, in academia, I'm doing my PhD. One of the sole reasons I'm doing my PhD is I know in order to do the change I want to do, I must be a doctor first before anything else. So at what point do we just sit here and critique and sort of like what I refer to as sparkly academia, right? We can always critique these words, but on a practical level, if I want to do a development project, that person in Shesheka in Zambia is not going to care whether I've used Global South to describe them or not. So how do we then actually do disruptive development, if I can call it, but not disruptive with the negative connotation, in the sense that we're actually doing foundationally transformative? And then what point do I practically say, okay, I might be reproducing something as coloniality here, but there also needs to be a way in which I can find room in order to develop.
Okay. Brilliant. No worries. That was wonderful. Does anybody else in the room want to contribute at this point, and then we'll come back to the panel with some responses.
Congratulations to the authors for bringing out such a nice, topic, title of the book, and the contents that you have included. I would like to just highlight some of the points that while the decolonization of the minds of global South and global North is very much required, but within the global South, that's where you need to focus that the colonized minds there. If you have the upper elitist class of politicians or bureaucrats, and you see the inequalities. We see the maximum inequalities in the global South. And see the kind of the work that is coming out. If we see COVID, the impact of COVID has been most disastrous in the entire global South, with so much of vulnerable populations and all that. But the research that has come out in 2021, one of the documents brought out by IDS, it highlighted that only 12% of the research on COVID has come from the entire global South, whereas they have suffered more than 60%. Second, in the post-COVID, if we say it in 2022, in the post-COVID era, if we see, of course there are still cases, but then in the entire global South, the allocation for health budgets has decreased. So what is the priority? And then there are gender inequalities. If you see entire South Asia, you are from Pakistan, I'm from India, and if we see the position of women, Human Development Index is the poorest in the entire global South, and there's no comparison with the North. Therefore, I think it needs to be also highlighted that within the global South, what kind of the mindset is there? That is, I think, more colonized mindset than the between the global South and global North. Thank you.
Okay. Interesting. Yeah. Why don't you come back on some of those? So there were some short questions and some really interesting reflections about power transformations.
Okay. The first question about INGOs, and is the leadership of INGOs perpetuating white saviorism? I think that was the question.
Yeah.
Absolutely, because INGOs are part of the system. They are the intermediaries between the money and who gets the money. And a lot of the INGOs are the one who actually control the process of how the money is delivered, how the funds are evaluated, who the beneficiaries will be. So I think absolutely they are second in line in terms of their leadership perpetuating this myth that we are going to save. I mean, I had a discussion once with the Save the Children's, one of their committees in Geneva. And I said, you know, your name itself says it all. You know, in the 21st century, we're talking about save the children. I said, if you want change, change your name first. You know, so absolutely, I think they absolutely are. What the cover image symbolizes to us is the idea that, I mean, the schema is very powerful for us, that this image of, you know, this white benevolence over a child. And we've got stories in our book that reflect this as well. The whole idea of volunteerism, or white people going into Africa and opening orphanages and sending children all over the world for adoption. I mean, no, we are saving these children from miserable, miserable lives. It's not just about children. I mean, it symbolizes, you know, the global South as a whole. But it was very powerful and striking to us in the sense that this is symbolizing the idea that there is this white benevolence above anyone and everybody who is non-white and belongs to us. So that's why we thought this really stood out to us. And we did an open call for the design of the cover, and this was done by somebody in the global South as well. Is there an alternative word to development? I don't even want to go there because I don't believe in alternatives. Whether it's global North, global South, development, white, black, I just do not believe in alternatives at all. I think language is absolutely important, but I think language also overshadows our own behavior and attitudes towards things. So no, I don't think there is, my colleagues, my co-editors may disagree, but that's just my opinion there. How do we reach people who have, who resist white saviors, perhaps, and in terms of audience? I mean, that is exactly what the book is there for. We are having a much bigger impact amongst the donor and the INGO development communities in Western countries with this book than we are having actually in our own countries. Most people in our countries don't know about the book at all, even though all the contributors are from there. But it is the donors, they are the audience for us, the governments, the policymakers in the global North. For us, they need to sit up and listen. So I think our book promotions, my reason for coming to the UK as well, we're promoting in Canada, where we're hoping to have other events in Europe. We're pushing it. And I think automatically this book is already being read more by them than it is by people in the global South. So that sort of happened by default. But that's what we want to do. That's absolutely the audience we want to reach, and we're trying our best to do that. Are we reproducing colonial mentality through DEI? Absolutely 100%. Again, I'm also totally against DEI. I think it's an absolute waste of time, and it does perpetuate because it's a token exercise, right? In fact, there was a survey that was done recently that said almost, I think over 80%, I could be wrong, of people who are in positions of DEI are actually white. You know, so they're either that, and the rest of them are either women, like you say, or they're black or brown people, and they're doing absolutely nothing because they're not allowed to do anything else. They're there just to show face. So absolutely, this is being perpetuated 100%. What can we do? A disruptive development, and this I think ties into the last question with yours. I mean, I think the whole idea is that it is people in countries like ours who need to be pushing back. I don't see much change happening here at all because the system is so powerful and so all-controlling, and nobody wants to lose jobs. Let's be honest about that. This is also about employment and jobs and being in high profiles, right? Nobody wants to lose that. So where should the focus be, and where should the pushback come from? It should come from us. And as you say, our minds are as colonized as anybody else's, and we need to start there. I know in Pakistan, same with India, we've got our privileged feudal and political elites who are doing exactly the same thing that we are saying white saviors are doing to us. A lot of people like to say that is the impact and influence of colonization on our country. I disagree. I think we have also had a history of control within our own communities and our countries. It's normal, it's natural, it happens everywhere. But I think colonialism did exacerbate that a lot. I mean, the colonizers left behind us a different issue of class and power as well, which is now manifested and which is actually destroying a lot of our countries. So we need to start there. We need to start in our own countries. We need to push back against the powers in our own countries first. COVID was an opportunity to do that. We failed miserably, but I also know there were examples like I'll use Pakistan. We actually handled the COVID response very well. People thought people don't want to be vaccinated in countries like ours. We had one of the highest vaccination rates in Pakistan in South Asia. And that's because people did want to get vaccinated, and vaccines were coming in not from the global north, but from China. And our relationship with China is political, and we took those vaccines, which were not accepted in the global north. I had to travel to Canada. I had Sinopharm. I was not allowed to travel to Canada because Sinopharm was not accepted there because it's Chinese, right? So yes, lots of complications, but I absolutely feel we should start from our end before. Sorry, spoken too much. If Mike can
Not at all.
very quickly.
I never think you speak too much. I think it's, I just love to hear you speak. So yeah, I mean, you said it all, but just to go back to the issue of how the white savior mentality manifests itself in the structures of NGO, and the very apt comment about the representation. And I hope, I don't remember, I can see the people who asked the questions, but a few people in the chat asked for who you were, because that was a very good comment. And I hope your dissertation is about that. So I've been involved in initiatives in the global north, and I think Themrise as well, in terms of I was in the anti-racism task force in the cooperation sector in Canada, for example, where we focused a lot on representation because that's the easy thing to do. But in my opinion, that's really accessory to the whole debate. I mean, it's important in a way to see people from all strands of life and all positionalities to be represented. But as you say, it's a heteropatriarchy, racialized patriarchal capitalism, and just putting marginalized people in spaces where there's potentially violence for them, where, you know, they don't have the space to actually criticize what they need to criticize. They don't feel comfortable. And so something I tried to push in those circles is, instead of just counting the number of racialized people, we should count promotion, we should count leadership, we should count retention. If people leave because they don't feel comfortable calling other people in or other people out, or if there's only like one very visible person that's on top, that's Black women, for example, and then no one else feels comfortable. And it's not just about racialized people from the global north or born in the global north. I'm a mixed race person born in the global north. I do not consider myself as needing, you know, that kind of representation, but that's often who gets the job in those countries, because in Canada we give jobs to Canadians. I think this, in the case of our field, it's really about global South people in our structure, and how, you know, we include, quote unquote, but we include at some levels and not others. We include at the level of project writing, but we don't involve at the level of call for paper writing or call for project writing and evaluation period. So these are two very crucial spaces or moments where we often include way less or consult way less, because that's like the parts we want to keep our power on. So anyways, it's an aspect, the representation in structures of NGO, but it's really, as you say, it's very marginal in how we think we should confront the system. And we talked about alternative words to replace development, Afrotopia, like I said, by Felwine Sarr, or talking about dignity, talking about justice, I think is much more interesting and important. And Themrise tackled a few of the other questions. So I don't know, Dixon, if you want to talk about some of it.
Yeah, I can just start by saying that currently, the person heading the IMF is a Nigerian, the IMF World Bank, maybe I'm mistaken the two. Michael, you can help me. It's a Nigerian lady, I think.
Yeah.
But has that changed the situation in Nigeria or Africa? I'm not going to answer that question.
Economist minister.
So the question of representation, which is shallow, doesn't really answer this debate. It doesn't answer this debate. The question is, who makes the decisions that matter? Secondly, people talk about colonization as if it ended. The assumption, the global north wants to think that colonization ended. It never ended. It just changed the color, just changed the offices, as we were discussing when Michael was here in Uganda. The offices that were for colonial masters simply turned into offices of development officers. So by saying that we shouldn't raise issues of colonization, we should move over them and go on, it has not stopped. It is still there. And secondly, even if it ended, if we want to assume it did, how many years ago? Just not even a few years ago. Some countries just got independence in the 80s, just in the 80s. So these vestiges of power and the structures are still there. Then what I want to end with is this. Those who really, I don't want to take people into classes of coloniality and all that, but in order to get away the practical or the physical representation of colonial power, countries in the global south had to really fight physically, died, many of them died, and a lot of evil happened. And all the spaces, some of the laws that we have still in our books were invented by colonialists to close spaces where coloniality could be questioned. Those laws are still there. So the only space that are remaining probably now, we have social media, and perhaps for us who can write some books, we're still continuing with the same struggle to try to deconstruct these structures of power so that we have a level playing field. So before even we start moving forward, the spaces are not leveled. So in the book, we try to raise that so that we keep this conversation going. We haven't gone over it, it's still going on. Thank you very much.
Great, thank you. So I think we've got time for some more. I know we've got a lot on the chat, so Gary, maybe you could read out quite a few, a little, give us a sense of the conversation that's happening there.
This is from Nabila. Are the terms white gaze and Western gaze synonymous and interchangeable?
Question.
This is from Julie. Do we see UKRI funding development centres in Pakistan or Bamako to study development here in Brighton?
Sorry, that was, can you just repeat that?
So do we see UKRI funding development centres in Pakistan and Bamako to study development in Brighton? So local development here. This is from, one of the things that also exists is a hierarchy in global south countries and the rich upper class that often mete out an equivalent rich person's saviour complex. I abhor this saviour complex in any context. But how do we get rid of this when the systems themselves are so hierarchical and unequal? Yeah, that's.
Okay, that's it.
Yeah.
Okay. All right. Are there any more questions in the audience?
Yeah. Any from the, yep.
Yeah. There.
Thank you very much for this very interesting presentation. I hope to be able to read the book. It sounds fascinating. On the topic of Afrotopia and Pan-Africanism, I wanted to ask if you think that such terms would only simply perpetuate kind of the colonial saviorist ideas that, you know, everyone in Africa is generally in need of so-called development, and the generalization that is taking place under colonial systems of power of people of very diverse societies and communities, and is countering saviorism with such terms and such ideas only going to perpetuate that coloniality, or is it going to actually dismantle it?
Yes.
Hello. In the UK, there's an organisation that raises funds called Comic Relief, and they raise money by broadcasting films which project a sense of need, and they raise money on the back of those. What advice would you give to Comic Relief?
Yeah, good point. Yeah.
I wanted to ask, when did your book come out, and where exactly in Global South have you done the book launch? Because you mentioned that there is more acceptance in the donors community, but then you also mentioned that there is a need for pushback from Global South. So my question is, I know you are doing a launch tomorrow again in London, but then I did not check where have you done before this. And why did you choose, if the target is Global South, maybe I'm not aware. Are we doing it in South as well?
Sure. Yeah, good points.
I just want to put some reflections in the room here out of my work on South-South cooperation. I'm myself a development practitioner for 12 years and IDSL alumni. So the concept of development in the North comes from the concept of charity, while from the South it comes from solidarity. And that's where the South-South cooperation is built up, anchored. The concept of solidarity. That's one thought. I'm not sure if it has been reflected in the book. Another thing is the discourse power still lies with the North. How do we change that balance, that the discourse power actually shifts to the South, and the terminology and the language becomes part of it? Because what terminology is the South coming up with when they talk about development? They adopt the one that is being brought out in the North. So just these two reflections.
Good. I think that would probably do us. So maybe if we could have any responses, maybe from Themrise and from colleagues on screen, and then and any final remarks you'd like to make as well. So
I will respond to a few of the ones that I can, and I'll let my colleagues respond to the others. The simplest one is our book was published about 6 weeks ago, I think, early February. We had our first official launch in Uganda this weekend. I was supposed to be in Uganda. All three of us were there. Micah was there. Dixon launched it, and that was our idea. We wanted it to be launched officially in the Global South first. So we had 2 launches in Uganda, one at Makerere University and one with No White Saviors. They are the organization that wrote the foreword. We also had a small event in Pakistan. There was a lot of interest in the book from my colleagues here in the UK, which is why we decided that I would come here and promote the book. We are also promoting the book in Canada because of the Canadian connection with Micah being there. So, we wanted to cover our own countries as well. And beyond that, honestly, book launches are not easy to do. It depends on who is interested in helping us out with it. So we would love this book to be launched in other countries of the Global South or the Global North. For us right now, they are equal. I mean, this is a book. Anybody who wants to read it can. It doesn't matter where you are or who you are. But there is a lot of interest more from the Global North, I think, because it's about them, right? It is talking to them. So I think our representation and job was done when we had people from the Global South come in and say what they needed to say. But we're hoping to do a second volume at some point, guys, because there were so many contributions we couldn't include. I think there's a lot more to say. So, but yes, the Global South Uganda was our first launch last weekend. So it was officially done there. What advice given to Comic Relief? Okay, so Comic Relief, wasn't that the organization that was told that you cannot use images, right? So Comic Relief works in Pakistan as well, used to work. I've worked with them on a couple of projects many, many years ago. To organizations like Comic Relief or others like them, like World Vision or even MSF, the controversy they've had recently about, using pictures of rape victims and survivors on the dark web that is sold for communication material. I mean, what advice can you give them? Don't do it. Just don't. I really don't know what, and communication and development is a big issue, right? It is based on the fact that you want to tug at heartstrings. So every single NGO, every single donor who has it on, their posters, their promotional material, what is on it? It's the picture of a person from, a non-white country. Our book has it as well. We do not disagree with the fact that we've done that as well, but ours has a connection to what's inside the book, But what connection do people have? What connection does Comic Relief have using, the image of a poor scarred child in a village somewhere in India or Pakistan and saying, please help us, give money to help this child because otherwise this child will die. It is exactly what the charity sector in the UK did a little while back when FCDO was cutting funding. They said, and that's why, and I know you reacted to it, they said these people will die if not realizing that the aid you're giving them really hasn't had the impact that, it should have had all these years. So why don't you look at that for a minute before asking for more money? So my advice would be, no, don't do it anymore, because I think more and more people are talking, against it, and we're not keeping quiet about it. Change of discourse in charity versus solidarity. I mean, I think the charity versus solidarity argument is very interesting, because I would do it the other way around. We in the Global South, for us, charity is our foundation of doing good and helping other people. And we are not very, we're not a very solidaristic, community in the Global South. A lot of us do not even work with each other. Look at South Asia, our countries do not communicate. So I think the solidarity aspect, the way I would see it in my work at least, comes from the Global North, and the charity aspect comes from the Global South. And that is very important, because charity in the Global South is what underpins our own independence towards the idea of assistance. We don't do it as wanting to help the poor because they need help. We do it because that is how culturally we have been told that you must always help. If you've got money to spend, help those who don't have enough, but don't do it because you feel sorry for them. Do it because you've got enough to give around and people need it. And whether the discourse, I mean, that's the whole idea, changing the power shift of the discourse from the North to the South, right? And we're hoping that this book is one of the ways to do it. By giving voice to Global South. And in terms of terminology, again, me personally, I don't think we need terminology, to be very honest with you. I think that's a very pedantic way of looking at things. I think it's about what we actually want to do on the ground, as opposed to how we want to express doing it. So even Global North, Global South, I wrote a piece on that a few months ago with my colleagues, on what should be the terminology in development, global development, and global health. And we came to the conclusion, let everybody decide themselves what they want to be referred to as. Why do we want to refer to sub-Saharan Africa? Let African countries decide how they want to be referred. Let South Asia decide. Let, the US, UK decide. Why do we have to have a common, collaborative terminology that puts everybody in a basket, which we may not all belong to? So I will take those questions, and I think Micah and Dixon could answer the one about the white gaze, the Western gaze. And I think there was one about the rich person's complex, which I think is very, very interesting. Yes, there is a rich person savior complex, because rich people always want to save the poor in any part of the world. And Pan-Africanism, I think Micah could take that.
Mm-hmm. Thanks, Themrise. And yeah, all very interesting questions. We're going, the time is flying, but so the terminology / using Afrotopia or other types of terminology, I think Ferwin Sarr was giving the keynote speech for an organization I'm involved in Canada, and he said it really aptly, because someone said, well, are you against development? Are you against education or life expectancy and all these things that are about human dignity? And he answered, no, I'm not against human dignity. So I think every term can be co-opted, that's true. But then if it comes from African philosophers who built approaches and philosophies, I don't see why we should dismiss them. They're not necessarily linked to white saviorism. And I'm not saying all Africans or all South Asians will develop concepts that are better or less white saviorism than Westerners. It's just that we should not dismiss all words, because then that makes us postmodern, and that it's a slippery slope towards never using any concepts to do the work. And also the thing is, as Themrise said, we can talk about terminology all night. Some people, will disagree. Even I'm sure, from Pakistan, Themrise can say something and then other Pakistani will say other things. And then, there's disagreement also within countries and within communities. So let's just do the work. Let's just challenge our practices and do better. For comic relief, it's so funny because yes, it's the same answer we'll give to the people who did Do They Know It's Christmas, the song. Because speaking of which, I don't know if you know the song Africa Stop Ebola, which was approximately in the same time as the second edition of the song Do They Know It's Christmas, the very white savior song. And that other song from African singers really had less let's say publicity or views, Africa Stop Ebola, but it was such a better song. So I wouldn't say all initiatives are bad, but that and comic relief type of narrative are really, really hurting or perpetuating racial hierarchies and who has agency. And I think that's going back to the question of representation is really something we need to tackle. And then, yes, white gaze, Western gaze. I answered the person also in private on the Q&A, but you're right. She was saying, or he was saying, I don't remember, that it's indeed not about white people. Brown and Black people can perpetuate a Western gaze, and it became a Western gaze because Western countries are not as white as they were, which is true. But then I still use white gaze following Paley, and notably because it's not about white people doing something or saying something or promoting a narrative. It's about everyone promoting a narrative of racial superiority, because this is kind of the same. It's it's the helping narrative, but it's also the idea that Westerners can help better and that white people have better solutions. So that goes with colorism, that goes with people who are like me, white passing or mixed race are going to be higher ranked in the hierarchy. So that's the whole structure we were talking about when we say white saviorism. Again, it's not just white people, and a lot of chapters talk about that in the book, and I hope you read it and give us your thoughts on it. But Dixon, do you want to go?
Should we just wrap up?
No, I'm not going to say much.
Maybe to keep it quite brief, because we're pretty much out of time, but maybe just a final word from you, Dixon.
Yeah, I'm just going to use an example. Micah talked about Kony 2012. You remember that video that was going around? But just put this at the back of your mind. At the same time, the so-called development partners were telling Uganda, this wasn't in the media, but telling Uganda not to recruit more soldiers and not to get more guns, to lessen on their ability to fight the rebel. But there was an NGO in the US asking for money to help victims of Kony rebellion. Let me stop it there.
Okay, fantastic. So I think that's it. I mean, what a great conversation, and certainly one that will continue. I mean, there's a sort of question which goes, okay, after listening to this, what's an Institute of Development Studies doing? And I fall back, not in a defensive way, in saying that we exist as a place for critical debate of exactly this kind. I would maintain quite insistently that development, which can be and often is defined around here as change or good change with all sorts of definitions of good, or transformative change, or indeed, as Mike has been using the terms dignity and justice, those are sitting there in the IDS mission statement for what it's worth. That's what development is about, and it's not the same as the aid industrial complex, which is in a sense what I read your book as being about largely, and I think those critiques are absolutely valid. I think these questions about charity versus solidarity, North versus South, whatever binaries we choose, I think binaries are always a problem. And the thing that I really take from your book is a message that I would like to think is at the heart of what we're all doing here, which is listening, making space for and fostering and appreciating diversity, challenging forms of power, challenging representation that is tokenistic, and trying to have exactly the kind of conversation that you're calling for. So I'd really just like to thank the three of you and all your contributors for putting it out there and making these contributions. Thank you to everybody who's contributed to the chat, and sorry we couldn't get to all of your questions. But I'd encourage everyone to read this, and wherever you are, keep these conversations going, because they're super important, I think, for all of us. So a big clap to our editors.
Thanks.
Thanks
for the invitation.
Thank you very much for having us, for organizing this. Thank you very much. It was lovely.